Australia is the greatest nation on earth. And at the referendum last year, Australians told the elites they want to keep it that way. Is 2024 the year mainstream Australians continue to secure our way of life, or will the elites strike back? In Season 3 of Australia's Future, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott will share his unique insight on the future of the Australian way of life. Hello Tony, and g'day to all of our listeners. Great to be back for another episode. Today we will be discussing the federal budget as well as Peter Dutton's budget in reply, the decision by the International Criminal Court in relation to Hamas and Israel, and also the broader international situation. Tony, great to be back.
Dan, lovely to be with you and to be talking to our increasing body of listeners.
Yes, well, it has been increasing pretty rapidly over the last few months, so it's been fantastic to see, and a big shout out to everyone in the studio who's making it look and sound fantastic. Look, let's kick off. We talked last time about the budget, and he gave a really great nationwide analysis of the budgetary situation. I also wanted to start by talking about Peter Dutton's budget reply speech. It was a fairly strong speech. It outlined a number of key policy issues that obviously the coalition wants to take to the election, foremost a fairly substantial cut to the net migration numbers. At a headline level, Tony, just to get your assessment of the budget and the budget in reply as it stands at the moment.
Well, Dan, look, the budget is the government's big annual set piece. It's not just a fiscal document, although that's important. It's really a statement of what the government's priorities are, where it wants to take the country. And as was patent on budget night, this is a government which is the most green left we've ever had. They really want to transform our whole economy from one based on fossil fuels and the benefits that our resources sector has given us over many decades now, to a so-called green energy, renewable energy superpower. Now, this idea that we can become a renewable energy superpower, as if we are the only country that has access to wind and sun, is frankly ridiculous. It doesn't withstand serious scrutiny. The costs of doing it will be immense, and in the process we will destroy the industries where we have had a comparative economic advantage and replace them with something that is implausible at best and deeply speculative in any event. So it was, I think, a very revealing and very dangerous, if I may say so, budget. I'm not accusing the government of being insincere. I think they are fanatically sincere.
Yeah, too sincere.
Fanatically sincere in a very damaging and dangerous direction. Then, of course, we had Peter Dutton's reply, and again, the budget reply is probably the single most important speech that an opposition leader will give in any 1 year. And I think it was the best speech that Peter Dutton has given as opposition leader, because he did crystallise the battleground on which he wants to fight the next election. Essentially, it's going to be over energy and immigration. While he certainly wants us to be a good global citizen, he doesn't think that emissions reduction should be the central plank of government. And while he certainly believes in Australia as an immigrant society, he plainly thinks that immigration at current levels, which is almost 1 million people in the last 2 years, is utterly unsustainable. It's damaging at many levels. It's driving wages down, it's driving housing costs up, it's clogging infrastructure, and at these rates, it's also threatening social cohesion because it's hard to accommodate this many people in every sense. So I think it was a revealing budget. It was a powerful budget reply. I do believe that the government has used the budget to set up a possible early election. And I think that Peter Dutton has effectively used the budget reply to, as it were, take up that challenge and indicate how a coalition government would be different and better should there be change.
So let's drill down on a couple of those issues. I'll just start with energy, which is really fascinating. So today and yesterday, the New South Wales Premier, Chris Minns, has all but indicated that Eraring is going to stay open. I think that's a positive thing for him to be doing, and good on him as a Labor leader to be recognising that. But it also reveals that net zero doesn't work. I mean, government shouldn't have to be paying coal stations to stay open if this new energy future was going to be so successful. So I guess there's that side of the equation. And then there's also the nuclear argument that the coalition is continuing to make to the community. So I'm just interested in your perspective on the New South Wales government decision there with Eraring, and also how do you think the nuclear debate is going in Australia?
Look, I agree with you, Dan, that Chris Minns is doing the right thing. And unlike the Victorian government, which was furtive and secretive about similar things here, Chris Minns is doing it with at least a degree of openness. But, you know, it is really a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, and it does show just how crazy things are. We subsidise renewables because we want to reduce emissions. We're now about to subsidise coal-fired power because we want to keep the lights on. And because all of this has driven prices through the roof, we've now got to subsidise consumers as well to meet the astronomical power bills. So this is the madness which has descended upon our energy policy. 20 years ago, we had amongst the world's lowest power prices. In fact, affordable energy was one of our few comparative economic advantages, at least in manufacturing.
Yep.
There were no subsidies. Private businesses were giving us affordable, reliable power, and they were doing the investment. They didn't need the taxpayers' help. And successive governments have conspired to ruin this because we have been running the power supply over the last 2 decades not to provide affordable and reliable energy, but to bring down emissions.
Yeah, it's a good point that you make, and it's been successive governments that have, basically been backing in the renewable energy, and it was Scott Morrison as Prime Minister who signed us up to net zero, which I think was a very big mistake. To move to the other part of it, the immigration numbers, Tony. So Peter Dutton has said a coalition government will have a net migration number of 160,000. That's about 30% lower than the government's forecasts. But as you rightly establish, over the last couple of years, we've had about 500,000 a year. So it's a significant drop from those very large, unprecedented numbers. Look, my view is it should be 5 figures, not 6 figures in terms of the net number to compensate for those very big problems. But still, it is a meaningful reduction that I think will have a positive impact on those issues that you've identified. In terms of the numbers and the scale, do you think it's about right? What's your view?
Well, interestingly, I gave a talk on this topic a few years ago as a backbench member of the coalition, where I argued for a return to immigration numbers at the average of the Howard era, which was just over 100,000. And at the time, I was savagely attacked by the then Treasurer, Scott Morrison, and I was told that this would cost $5 billion a year because the Treasury view is that more migrants means more tax revenue. Therefore, the lazy way to boost the economy is to bring in more migrants. Now, I still think that the ideal situation would be to go back to the average of the Howard years, which was quite high immigration by historical standards.
Yes.
But was nothing like the exploding numbers that we've had first under Kevin Rudd, when net overseas migration breached the 300,000 figure for the first time.
Yep.
And then since the pandemic, when it's been near or above 500,000 a year. And the problem with the government's proposal is that it says it wants to get immigration down, but it hasn't really told us how. We know that they've reduced the rate at which student visas are approved from about 90% to about 80%, they've flagged the introduction of individual caps on particular institutions, but they've said that they're subject to negotiation, and they've given the institutions an out if they promise to build student accommodation. But we all know how wobbly this kind of thing is. Now, what we've been getting from the coalition is first a definite cut in the permanent migration from 185,000 to 140,000, and hints of a more hard-hitting mechanism for reducing temporary migration. That's to say, hard caps on the universities and other so-called export education providers. Now, we all know that so many of these students are really looking for an immigration outcome rather than an education outcome. So many of our universities and colleges now have at the heart of their business model overseas students, and frankly, that's a corruption of the whole purpose of education. I mean, education is to broaden the mind. It's to push back the frontiers of knowledge. It's to impart something precious to the mind and to the soul of the students. If it becomes an excuse for someone to leave one country to live in another country, well, I'm afraid these institutions are conniving at something which is unworthy of them.
Just on the cap, the government has put legislation up about a week ago, and I wrote about this in the Daily Telegraph. If you actually read the legislation, it's a cap in name only. All it does is give the relevant minister the power to make a cap should the minister choose to do so. So there's no guarantee that numbers will even come down under this. Now, in Canada, they've cut it by a third. Even Justin Trudeau has got the message. So I think people, as you say, people don't understand why this is happening.
And this is a government which has become quite skilled at passing legislation of a performative nature. It gives the government the ability to say it's doing something, but then having been given the ability, it doesn't actually use it, like the legislation that was passed in a hurry at the end of last year to give the government, the minister, the ability to seek a preventive detention order for foreign criminals who were let out of immigration detention under that court decision. As far as we know, not a single preventative detention order has been applied for, even though the government told us back then that it was absolutely urgent.
Yeah. I just want to pick up on a point you make there about, in essence, universities have been dictating our migration policy. They've basically brought in the students they want. The government says fine. Doesn't it also get to this point where, Dutton announces these cuts, which, as I say, are not huge, but they're meaningful and noticeable. Then the usual suspects come out and say, it's racist to do this and so forth. Isn't one of the big challenges we really have that when you look at migration, you mentioned Treasury loves big migration because it boosts the bottom line. You've got gullible politicians like Scott Morrison that say, yeah, that's great. That's an easy way to get the GDP up. But you've also got big business that love it because it suppresses wages. It means they don't have to train Australian workers.
Provides a larger market, etc.
A larger market. So do you think it's actually going to be possible, given all those very well-funded, entrenched, powerful interest groups, for the coalition to successfully rein in migration? Has it, in other words, have things got so difficult with these interest groups that making change is now not impossible, but much more difficult than it once was?
There's no doubt that there are powerful vested interests in favour of ever higher migration. No doubt about that. There's, as you say, there's big business which wants a bigger pool of cheap labour. They want larger numbers of consumers. There are the universities which are absolutely dependent upon this for their revenues. Then, of course, there's the various ethnic lobbies which are only too happy to justify their existence by accusing governments and political parties of racism. So, look, there are big lobbies to be overcome. If you look at Peter Dutton's record as Border Protection Minister, he was very resistant to politically correct lobbying. He was very determined to do the right thing by Australia. You might remember that Peter Dutton was the Border Protection Minister and I was the Prime Minister when, for the first time in recent years, we made some explicit value judgments in an immigration context. This was when we specified that the 12,500 additional refugees we were going to take in from the Syrian war zone would be from persecuted minorities. In other words, not the kind of people who were going to be difficult here and who could expect to be reasonably well at home back there. And under that program, we took in a large number of Christians, quite a few Yazidis and others. We didn't just accept the people that the UNHCR offered to us, which is what normally happens under that part of the program. So look, this is where I think the Labor Party are making a mistake with Dutton. They're accusing him of being this hard-hearted monster. They're accusing him of being this tough guy. Well, I think a tough guy who will actually stand up to the vested interests and the politically correct outrage industry is exactly what Australia needs right now.
Well, that's right. And they said similar things about you and similar things about John Howard. You were too conservative, too Christian, too right-wing. Your success is obvious and apparent. John Howard, second longest serving Prime Minister. This is their playbook.
Exactly right. They could never work out with John Howard whether he was an ogre or a wimp. And therefore, John Howard was able to win a lot of elections and become one of Australia's very greatest prime ministers. And I think that Peter Dutton, in his own way, has the potential to be another Howard. And I think we saw something of that in the budget reply speech the other week.
So what else does the coalition need to do then between now and the election? So you've indicated that there could be an early election. I think the Prime Minister is trying to deflate those expectations, but I don't know. But is it really now a matter of prosecuting the arguments on energy and immigration, or what's your perspective?
Well, just on the early election issue, I think that Anthony Albanese and his senior colleagues are worried that this is as good as it gets for them.
Yep.
They've just brought down a budget with tax cuts, handouts and a surplus. Plainly, a lot of it's been built on smoke and mirrors, but nevertheless, at least for the moment, it looks okay. The next budget will be much worse, much worse. And this is why I think there is quite a strong prospect of a pre-Christmas election. What does the coalition do? Well, I think the coalition has, as I said, picked a couple of areas where it wants to fight, significant areas where it can be a clear alternative, and I think we've already seen what the alternative is in terms of energy and immigration. I think the other thing that the opposition inevitably will do is start to point out to people that the Albanese government really is an experiment that's failed. We've now had the Albanese government for 2 years. It came into office promising to be safe change, promising to cut power bills by $275 per household per year, promising that interest rates would stay low, promising that real wages would grow. And it's failed on all counts. Power bills have gone up by at least double the promised cut, and the $300 handout, the $300 one-off handout is certainly not going to compensate families for that. Real wages have been squeezed throughout the Albanese government's time. As we know, interest rates have basically doubled. Repayments for most mortgage holders have doubled. That's causing excruciating difficulties for many, many, many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of households. And all of the underlying factors that are so important are going in the wrong direction, productivity in particular, social cohesion in particular. So I think this is a government which has proven that collectively it is not up to the job of running our country. And if there's one issue where I think this has become absolutely glaring, it's the government's response to the anti-Semitism that is now sweeping our country, defacing our country, debasing and embarrassing and shaming our country. And really, from the Prime Minister down, the government has been sitting on the fence. They cannot denounce anti-Semitism without bracketing it with an almost non-existent Islamophobia. The longer the Hamas-Israel struggle goes on, the more pro-Hamas this government looks.
Yes.
And the latest shameful error has been this inability of the government to be critical of the International Criminal Court bid to have not just Hamas leaders arrested for war crimes, but to have the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister of Israel arrested for war crimes. Now, this idea that there can be moral equivalence between the liberal democratic government of Israel pursuing a just war in its right of self-defence and an apocalyptic death cult in Hamas, absolutely and utterly pledged to the total destruction of Israel, a new Holocaust, it's wrong. But instead of looking at questions of principle or Australia's national interest, the Prime Minister seems completely consumed by the electoral politics of some seats in Sydney and Melbourne and by the dreadful tensions inside the Labor Party between the traditional right and the Green left.
Well, let's build on that, Tony. So the International Criminal Court, just for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, so that was established under the Treaty of Rome. You were a senior cabinet minister in the Howard government when Australia was a signatory to establishing that. So can you just explain what the International Criminal Court is and what powers does it actually have over sovereign nations? For instance, if they were to issue an arrest warrant over an Australian, would that have any practical effect, or how does it actually work?
Well, if they were to issue an arrest warrant over an Australian, we, under the terms of the treaty, are supposed to arrest that person and hand them over to the International Criminal Court for appropriate trial and judgment. If the court decides to accede to the prosecutor's demand for an arrest warrant on Bibi Netanyahu, were Bibi Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, to come to Australia, the Australian government will be obliged under the treaty to arrest him.
So that's why
and
they're
hand
saying
him over,
he can't come here, basically,
and hand him over to the court. Now, not all countries follow the rules. Recently, I can't remember the exact circumstances, but a country that was a party to the treaty did have someone in the country who was subject to an ICC arrest warrant and didn't act upon it. But we tend to be pretty faithful in our in discharging our duties under these treaties. And look, the whole problem with the ICC is that it was supposed to deal with malefactors in countries that had no adequate systems for dealing with malefaction. And yet Israel has a very well-functioning legal system. The Israeli legal system is so well-functioning that presidents and prime ministers have been sent to jail under their system. And yet the ICC in seeking these arrest warrants is essentially telling the world that Israel does not have an adequate justice system, and in going after Israel for simply exercising its right of self-defence, they're effectively making self-defence very difficult, at least for a democracy which is trying to honour its international obligations. It's a terrible departure from the ordinary norms, and this is one of the reasons why the Howard cabinet was deeply split on this issue back at the time. There were many of us in the cabinet who believed back then that the ICC was all well and good, but that for a country like us that had a well-developed system of justice, it was unnecessary and potentially harmful because given the ability of international institutions to be penetrated by countries that don't really have the rule of law in their DNA, we could easily find that Australians were unfairly subject to this court, even though we could be much more confident that genuine justice would be administered by our own courts than by any international tribunal.
Now that we've seen how the ICC operates, is it worth having a debate about whether it's time for Australia to withdraw from that treaty? Has its usefulness sort of passed its use-by date?
Well, let's wait and see what happens here. It's possible that the court itself might reject the prosecutor's application for arrest warrants or might alter the prosecutor's applications for arrest warrants. It may be that the court itself will accept the application in respect of the Hamas leaders, but not in respect of the Israeli leaders. So let's wait and see how it operates. But if the court becomes completely debased and this application by the prosecutor is a very bad sign, it's a very worrying straw in the wind, then I think that would be a live option for us.
I just want to build on that and to talk about the broader international situation. So we hear a lot about a two-state solution but in terms of Israel and Palestine. My understanding is both the government and the opposition support that, or progress being towards that, I think is the words that Peter Dutton has used. Is that something that you think is the goal that we should be working towards? And I think there's a lot of confusion in the community about what would that take, because Palestine is not a state, a nation state in any recognisable sense. So what does it actually mean when people talk about a two-state solution?
Well, the idea was that Israel would exist as a Jewish homeland, and that Gaza and the West Bank would become the state or statelet of Palestine as, if you like, a Palestinian homeland. Now, Australia supported and has long supported a two-state solution with this very, very significant proviso that any Palestinian state clearly accept Israel's right to exist behind secure borders. And that's what no Palestinian leader has ever really been prepared to concede. Yasser Arafat once genuflected towards it in English, but was never prepared to say it out loud in Arabic, and no subsequent Palestinian leader has been prepared to go as far as Yasser Arafat was prepared to go 20-odd years back. I think the prospect of getting any conceivable Palestinian leadership to agree to Israel's right to exist behind secure borders is negligible at best. So I think there's no realistic possibility whatsoever for any satisfactory progress towards a two-state solution at this time. I think we just have to accept that it's an impossible dream, at least for the foreseeable future, and work towards trying to ensure that the terrorism which has emanated from Gaza and also from the West Bank is, as far as possible, eliminated. It's interesting that Gaza was under the control of Egypt prior to the 1967 war. The West Bank was under the control of Jordan prior to the 1967 war. Both Egypt and Jordan are countries with which Israel has a good working relationship. I know that the Egyptians and the Jordanians don't want to buy into unnecessary trouble, but frankly, the best outcome today, in my mind, would be if Egypt were to resume responsibility for Gaza and Jordan were to resume responsibility for the West Bank, because these are both, at least by Middle Eastern standards, reasonably competent governments, reasonably efficient administrations, and at least in terms of religion and ethnicity, you'd think that the people of the West Bank and the people of Gaza could hardly object to being run by the Egyptians or the Jordanians.
The other issue that we talked a little bit about last time, Tony, is how the position of our government puts us at odds with that of our most important ally, which is the US and also the UK. That was in relation to Palestine having permanent membership of the UN. Now, this has then come up again. Joe Biden, to his credit, who I think has been a very ordinary president, has been very good and strong on Israel, and he has clearly rejected the ICC's, or at least the prosecutor's undertakings, whereas our government has failed to do that and failed to align with our most important ally on that matter. What does this mean for our alliance with the United States and also with others such as the United Kingdom?
Well, these alliances are based on a community of interests and, very importantly, a community of values. These are really strong partnerships that we've had over many decades with countries that are fundamentally like-minded. And what seems to be happening at the moment is that the like-mindedness of Australia with Britain and America is rapidly diminishing. And that's because, as I say, the Albanese government is turning out to be by far the most left-wing government we've ever had, a government which seems to be tainted by cultural Marxism and can't help but see what's happening in the Middle East through the prism of people oppressing and being oppressed, instead of seeing it through the prism of fundamental human rights and universal human decencies, of which Israel is clearly an exemplar and Hamas is clearly not. So I think there is an intellectual divergence here which is not going to do our country much good if it persists. Now, there's an election coming up in Australia within 12 months, which could bring us back to a more sensible position. There's an election coming up in Britain, which could take Britain away from the relatively sensible position it has right now. There's an election coming up in the United States that could reinforce good sense on America's part. So again, as always, there are choices to be made. Good choices produce better outcomes. Poor choices produce worse outcomes. As Paul Keating once said, change the government, you change the country. I fear our country is drifting backwards right now because this hasn't been a good government.
Well, it's hard to avoid that conclusion, Tony. So we might leave it there for today. Appreciate you making the time. I know you've got a jet off shortly. You'll be away for a couple of weeks in Eastern Europe, in the UK and in the US. So you're very much in demand on the international circuit. So we appreciate you taking the time as always. So Tony, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.